Welcome everyone. Glad to see you today. This is going to be our first virtual presentation of the Guadalupe Basin Coalition's Hill Country Summit. Really glad y'all could join us today. My name is Nathan Pence, and I'm the Executive Manager of Environmental Science and Community Affairs for the Guadalupe-Blanco River Authority. And today I plan to talk a little bit about endangered species in the Central Texas region and the Guadalupe River Basin and issues that we face here in our local area due to having endangered species around this area. The Central Texas region, the Guadalupe River Basin, we are no stranger to endangered species here in this region because of the hill country limestone and some of the other unique ecological features that we have in the area. We definitely have more endangered species around here than some other areas of the country. I think most folks are aware that under the Endangered Species Act, you're not allowed to kill an endangered species. I think most folks know that. But I think what a lot of folks don't know is that the Endangered Species Act actually has prohibitions that go much beyond killing an endangered species. And they actually use the term take. And so the legal definition of take by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is to harass, harm, pursue, hunt, shoot, wound, kill, trap, capture, or collect any threatened or endangered species. So the point there being it's much, much broader than just killing an endangered species. It's impacting them or influencing them in some way negatively. I give these same sorts of presentations to school groups and to kiddos sometimes. And so I'll ask that group of kids, if there's an endangered species over in the corner of the room, and I look over at them and I go, boom, and that endangered species moves from side to side by 5 feet, is that take? Some of the students will answer yes, but the majority answer no. And I would assume probably with adults, it would be the same thing. But by the legal definition of take, if I have caused that endangered species to move 5 feet that it normally would not have moved, that is most definitely take according to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. One other example I use with the kids sometimes, if you have a nocturnal endangered species, meaning they move around at night, they feed at night, they sleep during the day, that sort of thing, and you turn on a bunch of lights in your backyard at nighttime, or as a city, we light up our streets and have lights that we do for safety reasons, of course, and that's very important. But to that nocturnal species, is turning on those lights take? We haven't killed them, nothing like that, but is it take legally? Again, the kiddos would answer. Most of them say, no, it's not take. You haven't done anything that bad. But by the legal definition of take, according to U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, that light most definitely represents take to that nocturnal species. Changes its photo period. Maybe what it eats won't come out at night because there's lights on now or something like that. Many animals use the stars and the lack of light for navigation and migratory routes. And so when you turn on a bunch of lights, that most definitely can impact their ability to migrate or to move around. And so again, the whole point behind this is to make sure everyone understands that it's not just the killing of an endangered species that's prohibited, but it's negatively impacting or influencing them in some other way. I mentioned right at the beginning, we're no stranger to these species or these issues in the Central Texas region or in the Guadalupe River Basin. Utilities, municipalities, industries, private landowners up and down the river and in our area, and stakeholders, we have faced these issues before and we have solved them positively, both for the industry or the business operation that's taken place, but also to the species benefit as well. The Endangered Species Act provides us tools, it provides us mechanisms with which to do, and we have utilized those tools here in the local area numerous times. The primary tool that we have used is a habitat conservation plan that results in an incidental take permit. And if you're not familiar with endangered species, if you don't live in the endangered species regulatory world on a daily basis like some of us do, those terms and those mechanisms can be a little daunting, maybe a little overwhelming even, and even the basic definition some folks use incorrectly. So wanted to make sure I provided you with those definitions up front. An incidental take permit is a permit that you receive from the federal government, from U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And that permit essentially allows you to continue your legal and lawful business activities or private activities, even though those activities could cause take to an endangered species. That permit often has stipulations or restrictions or criteria in it about the magnitude of the impacts that you can have, but that incidental take permit does allow you to do that legally. A habitat conservation plan, that's the document or the plan that is submitted to U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in advance of receiving your incidental take permit. And that habitat conservation plan outlines what activities that you conduct that either do or may cause take to an endangered species, as well as that habitat conservation plan then lays out the impacts to those species, what positive things you're going to do to minimize and mitigate those impacts. So it outlines the positive things you're going to do to help the species. And then kind of the last thing that most all HCPs have as a requirement is to provide for a funding mechanism to establish that funding stream that will assure the federal government that you, in fact, can implement that HCP and have the resources behind it with which to do so. HCPs, habitat conservation plans, incidental take permits, ITPs, those tools under the Endangered Species Act are very important. And again, we've used them here locally. But once you get that ITP in your hand, that's essentially like an environmental insurance plan. If someone wished to challenge you under the Endangered Species Act, whether that would be an environmental group or a competitor or a regulator here locally, that incidental take permit's essentially your get out of jail free card when you go to court. It's also very powerful in the court of public opinion too, for folks to know you're doing the right thing and wanting to take care of a species and also provide for development and business that continues. One of the things that an incidental take permit also does that I want to make sure and stress is it provides for stability and sustainability for the business operations, for the utility operations, the industry, or for a landowner who conducts agriculture or other activities on their property. Even if you're getting away with that right now or you're conducting those activities and there's endangered species around that area, no one's sued you yet, no one's challenged you yet, you haven't made a headline in a newspaper, so you feel like you can continue those activities, that's not stable. At any point, either an environmental group or U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or another entity can come in and either sue or challenge that you're not complying with the Endangered Species Act. And then you face the potential of having to change the way you do operations, change how you utilize the resource that you were using. Once you get that incidental take permit in your hand, that can't happen to you under the legal framework. And so as like a utility, you can plan far into the future for the amount of water that you would have to use or the amount of electricity that you would be able to produce, or knowing the fiscal impact of having to manage those species and do positive things. I've mentioned several times there's examples of this here locally in the Central Texas area or the Guadalupe River Basin. And so the Edwards Aquifer, I think, is a great example that a lot of folks might be familiar with. There's numerous endangered species that live in the aquifer or live at the spring openings at Comal and San Marcos Springs. And there's a few of them shown here in the PowerPoint, just a small set of them. And the Edwards Aquifer, it's been the subject of litigation and challenge for the last 30 years plus over endangered species issues and endangered species that reside in the springs in the aquifer. The local group here in San Antonio, San Marcos, New Braunfels, out west through Medina and Uvalde counties for the agriculture, the group got together and everyone was fearful that under the Endangered Species Act, if we didn't solve this issue on our own locally, that the federal courts would take over the Edwards Aquifer and tell us how we could or could not use the aquifer, depending on which side of the fence you were on the issue. We all decided in the region, no matter which side of the issue you were on, that it would be better to chart our own path forward, determine how the resource was used and how to protect the species there, than having the court tell us how to do that. And so a group of stakeholders got together. They went through a process, developed a habitat conservation plan for the Edwards Aquifer and the use of the water from the aquifer. It did result in an issued incidental take permit about 8 years ago. And for the last 8 years, that HCP has been very successful in providing for management of the water use in the aquifer and also providing spring flow and benefit for the species that come out and the bronfels and down in the aquifer. And interestingly enough, we've talked about water use and we've talked about protecting habitat for the species. But often when you use the Endangered Species Act as a tool and you develop a habitat conservation plan or an incidental take permit, humans benefit from those same benefits that the species get, either quality of life, recreation, the ability to protect habitat and get outdoors. And so while it is about the species, it is also about humans at the same time. I think another example here locally that folks would be familiar with is the Goldencheeked Warbler in the hill country of Texas. The Goldencheeked Warbler is a songbird that uses specific types of trees to nest and for its habitat. And so back in the mid 80s, Austin and the development growing in Austin was encroaching on warbler habitat and see an issue coming to the forefront. And so the Balcones Canyonlands Preserve and the Balcones Canyonlands Plan, Habitat Conservation Plan, was put together and formed. They were successful in getting an HCP put together and they submitted it to U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, resulted in an issued incidental take permit. And since about the mid-90s when that plan came on board, the BCCP, Balcones Canyonlands Preserve Plan, it has most definitely been a very important tool in Austin that has allowed for development to continue and even expediting that development at times. But it has also been instrumental in setting aside large swaths of land for the species, for the songbird specifically, pieces of land that wouldn't have otherwise been conserved and kept as green space. And then the city of Austin, the humans, if you will, that live in Austin, they've also benefited from that because it preserved those large green spaces that are used for recreation or used for hiking, used to get outdoors, and otherwise that would probably have become concrete at some point or another. And so again, another great example of how HCPs can be used successfully to facilitate and handle endangered species issues. A few other examples that I wanted to mention as successful HCPs or habitat conservation plans in the Central Texas area include the Williamson County HCP in North Austin, the Southern Edwards Plateau Habitat Conservation Plan in Bexar County in the San Antonio area, Comal County Habitat Conservation Plan, which is another songbird HCP, and then the Lost Pines HCP in and around the Bastrop area for the Houston toad. That's a fairly new one, but it has been successful since its inception. I mentioned to the group that we had handled some species successfully using habitat conservation plans and receiving incidental take permits, and I went through a few of those examples. But the next set of issues that we're going to be facing, the next endangered species that we're going to have to deal with, largely reside in the Guadalupe River Basin, all the way from the headwaters in Kerr County to the bay and the delta down in Calhoun County. And just a few examples of some of those species within the Guadalupe River Basin that we may be dealing with in the very near future would include the whooping crane, which is a coastal migratory bird already listed by U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service as endangered and really relies heavily upon the Guadalupe River system during the wintertime when it overwinters here in Texas. There is a group of salamanders up in the hill country of Texas above Canyon Lake on the Guadalupe River system. The Cascade Salamander just being one example of those salamanders, but is one that is very susceptible to bad water quality and potentially some other things. And so U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is considering those salamanders for listing. Another group of species that we have in the Guadalupe River, which is being considered for listing by U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, is freshwater mussels. There are 3 freshwater mussels shown on the screen here. And interestingly enough, all 3 of them are endemic to the Guadalupe River. Endemic means they're found nowhere else in the world other than the Guadalupe River. And so if I was a betting man and I was hedging my bets, I would imagine that U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service would end up listing at least one of these freshwater mussel species that you see on the screen right now. A couple other species that I wanted to mention, the piping plover and the black rail are coastal species, coastal birds that U.S. Fish has listed and is considering listing. And then one last species that I wanted to actually show and mention is the Guadalupe bass. The Guadalupe bass is not listed as endangered by U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and it's not being considered for listing right now. But our state resource agency, Texas Parks and Wildlife, lists the Guadalupe bass as a species of greatest ecological concern or species of greatest need. Essentially, while it's not listed as endangered, it does have challenges on the horizon. There are some things that may be compromising its habitat or something like that. And so it is a focal species to keep an eye on. We want to try and prevent it from getting on the endangered species list. So if there's anything we can do now to help prevent that, that would be in our favor. And as I mentioned, it is the state fish of Texas, so very notable, a lot of attention. And one of those species that we just generally want to help out if we can. I keep using this term issues when it comes to endangered species, talking about overcoming these issues or looking out for these issues. And so I want to take a minute and kind of define, what do I mean by when I say an endangered species issue or an endangered species issue under the Endangered Species Act? If you'll go back and remember that broad definition of take that we talked about in the very beginning, if you conduct any sort of activities as a business or a municipality or an industry, or as a private landowner conducting agriculture or something like that on your property, and you do anything that might be considered to cause take to one of those species, and remember that broad definition of take, then that's an issue. That's where that comes up. That's where there's a conflict between the activity and the endangered species and the use of the endangered species habitat. And so just a few examples that I wanted to mention to folks to kind of get you thinking about what creates those issues and what sorts of things we may need to overcome. There are wastewater discharges up and down the Guadalupe River Basin. When you put water back into the receiving stream that's of a different temperature or a different quality, even if it's a better quality, it's not what the species is used to. And that could create some issues. GBRA and other entities up and down the Guadalupe River operate hydroelectric dams to produce electricity. There's water intakes up and down the river, whether that's for raw water that's delivered to customers or treated water that goes to your house. Intakes can create some issues. GBRA operates canals and a diversion system down on the lower Guadalupe around the coast to deliver water to customers and to facilitate agriculture and irrigation. The way that we're growing, we have projects planned in the future, both as GBRA, and there's other utilities that have projects planned in the future to be able to develop additional water supply. And so the Mid-Basin Project and the Lower Basin Project are great examples of those sorts of future planned activities. GBRA operates a saltwater barrier down in the lower basin. There's distribution systems. So whether you talk about moving water or whether you talk about moving electricity, those distribution systems can intersect or bisect endangered species habitat and create some issues. Industries, whether they use water in their production process or use it for cooling, or they may have a discharge based on whatever process or operations they have, industries can create those issues. Agriculture, we all have to eat, but that doesn't mean that it can't create take of an endangered species during the growing season or preparing the fields. Habitat modification, and that can be as simple as where a new road or a new bridge crosses the river, or if somebody puts in a retaining wall along their property, that can modify habitat that's used by endangered species. And then of course, here in the Central Texas region, Texas in general, we are growing like crazy. There is new development all the time. And just in general, depending on what kind of development you're talking about or where it's at, that could create issues. Potential take is that issue, again, that I wanted to make sure and drive the message home for. You have two choices when it comes to your endangered species and how to handle potential activities that may cause take. You can sit back, wait for an environmental group or a competitor or a neighboring landowner or a regulator, if you will, to challenge you under the Endangered Species Act and essentially allege that you're not protecting the species and complying with the Endangered Species Act. At that point, when you get that far, it often results in litigation, some sort of court proceedings or something along those lines. Or your second option is to be proactive. Get out in front of the issue. Pay attention to what species are going to be listed. Think through your activities and know if you may be causing potential take. And then proactively work with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the other stakeholders in the basin to develop a habitat conservation plan, to quantify your impacts and quantify your benefits as well. And by looking at the slide here that I have up and the little kind of cartoon graphic, it's probably not too hard to tell where I and GBRA fall on that subject, but it's the same sort of thing. Do you want a life jacket on now before you fall into the river? Or do you want to fall into the river and start drowning and then I'll throw you the life-saving dinghy after you fall in? I think most all of us would agree we'd rather be wearing the life jacket up front and get in front of that issue before it becomes life-threatening, before it becomes an endangered species issue, if you will. So right up front, we definitely believe that being proactive is the right way to tackle that. Often planning for the species, establishing an HCP, receiving your incidental take permit can be much cheaper than litigation and having to go through the court system. And so doing the right thing up front, it's the best way to protect the resource. It helps the endangered species, again, provides for that sustainability of your operations. But I also like to throw in there, it can be a great PR tool. It can be great speaking points. It can open doors when you do the right thing as well. You're perceived to be that good steward of the resource. Just as others have learned, the Edwards Aquifer being an example, the BCCP being another example, and some of the others that I've shown, and there's nationwide examples as well. An HCP for the Guadalupe River Basin could most definitely be that tool, could be that mechanism to allow us to handle our endangered species issues moving forward into the future. And I'm talking a lot about GBRA and our services and our customers and providing those services to customers. And that's kind of what you see on the screen here. But it's not just GBRA. There's a multitude of other entities and utilities, municipalities, industries, farmers that provide services as well. And a habitat conservation plan can most definitely be that tool to allow them to continue their operations as well. And so getting to that punchline, I don't think anybody's going to be surprised at this point. GBRA has begun the process of establishing a Guadalupe River habitat conservation plan. And ultimately, what we're going to be seeking is an issued incidental take permit from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service that allows us to continue our legal and lawful activities that may cause take of an endangered species, and provides for the protection and the stewardship of the resource and the species themselves. It's a win-win type of a scenario. We're really new in this process. We're just embarking on it, if you will. But there's a few things that I can tell you about what we have done and what we plan to do. And then, of course, I'll lay out some of our next steps and things of that nature to establish a habitat conservation plan for the Guadalupe River Basin. First thing I want to say, it is going to be river basin in scale, geographically. So from the headwaters up in Kerr County to the bay and the delta down in Calhoun County, we intend to cover that and everything in between. Not just GBRA's property or our locations of operations, but the entire river basin so that others could take advantage of it as well. Definitely want to take a comprehensive or a holistic approach, if you will. If we cover the multitude of species that we showed today and that some of the others that we haven't talked about yet, by protecting the species, often what you end up doing is protecting the entire ecosystem. And so again, it's river, basin, and scale. It's not just where one species live, but by benefiting that species, you benefit other species in the entire habitat too. And that is the approach that we would want to take. It will probably focus mostly on freshwater species, but as you get down to the coastal area, it could cover marine species as well. And we do plan to include the Guadalupe Delta and the San Antonio Bay as covered areas. And so I think in those areas, we'd end up covering some marine species. We're thinking mainly aquatic and marine species. I've been talking about the river, but the riparian corridors on rivers, so the area immediately on the bank and in the flood zone, you have a lot of terrestrial species that utilize those areas as well, either for feeding or for habitat, or maybe they use it as a migration corridor or movement corridor. And so we could also end up covering terrestrial species under this HCP if they're connected to the water or the river in some way or another. An approach that we intend to take, or some components of the approach that we intend to take, we most definitely want to be transparent and open with what we're doing. We do not want to create an HCP in a vacuum or a box and then roll it out to everyone. So we are starting to create buy-in within the basin now. We've been collaborating with stakeholders and talking with them already, and we will do a lot more of that as we move into the future. We will, of course, take input from the public, and we'll have some public meetings where we give presentations about what's going on and what we've developed. One of the things I want to mention up front, we do not know everything about the species that we have talked about. There are some unknowns. I can't tell you that I know everything about the Guadalupe River or the Guadalupe River Basin either. So we're going to be committed to working with the best available science and data that we have today, but also committing to continue to do research and generate new information. And then we'll have an adaptive management process or an adaptive management loop in our habitat conservation plan where we can go back and incorporate any new information that we have learned, either whether it's about the species or their habitat or changing conditions in the river. A couple of things that I know our HCP would probably include. One, it would probably include elements of the Guadalupe-Blanco River Authority and the Aransas Project agreement. That is an agreement that had to do with the whooping crane on the coast and making sure to protect habitat for the whooping crane and refugia areas for the whooping crane down on the coast. And so as the whooping crane would be a species that we would want to cover, rolling those elements in just seems to make logical sense and be a mechanism to get it implemented and funded. The next two bullet points on the screen, I want to spend just a little bit of time on. If GBRA established a habitat conservation plan and it was just for GBRA and just for GBRA's activities, I think that would be short-sighted and remiss as GBRA as a regional leader in the river basin. We want to make sure there's a mechanism that we can extend our take coverage under our incidental take permit to other users of the river and to other stakeholders. So it's going to be very important to us to develop a mechanism that provides that incidental take protection umbrella to others, not just to GBRA. And then also, we have had conversations with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service about operating potentially a mitigation bank. Mainly that's been associated with the whooping crane, and that might even allow folks from outside of Texas to provide funds or mitigation for the whooping crane and whooping crane restoration. And so we're going to explore that idea as we move into the future. Progress to date, letting you know what we've actually done so far. First, the GBRA Board of Directors did pass a resolution of support back in 2019. That resolution did direct staff at GBRA to move forward with a habitat conservation plan, directed us to look for funding sources, and then also instructed us to start talking to stakeholders and letting folks know what we're planning and making sure we were open and transparent about where we're headed. We have already started engaging stakeholders and talking with stakeholders. Presentations such as this is a great way to get the information out and to let people know, but we've also been conducting one-on-one meetings. I've had quite a few meetings with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and Texas Parks and Wildlife Department. we want to make sure our regulators know what we're doing and that we have their support and that we're headed in the right direction. And doing that up front is very important. We issued a request for qualifications to help us hire a consultant to draft and plan our habitat conservation plan. And building the team, making sure we have enough resources at GBRA, the bandwidth to actually pull this off and do it is an instrumental piece. And so we've been building that team and hiring some staff that's going to help us achieve the goal. I think there's typically two reasons that HCPs are not successful. The first one I think has to do with stakeholder buy-in and openness and transparency. And you've heard me mention that we are committed to being very open, being very transparent, and we're already having those conversations with stakeholders. The second thing that I see results in an unsuccessful habitat conservation plan is not having the resources, not having the bandwidth to start the project and see it all the way through to the end. And more specifically, I'm talking about funding. Folks start a process like a habitat conservation plan without a good knowledge of the resource that it actually takes to get across the finish line. And so before we've even started our planning process, one of the first things I did was make sure we had secure funding to do it. And so as you can see on the screen here, and I do believe in that little graphic on the right, it is time to invest. It is an investment in the future. It is an investment in the operations. And the GBRA board realizes that wholeheartedly. And so the board has set aside $100,000 annually to help fund the habitat conservation planning process. We've repurposed some other conservation funds and some other species funds to the tune of $250,000 annually that would be available to help us plan. And then one of the big accomplishments, one of the things we're really proud about, is we were awarded a Section 6 grant by the Department of the Interior, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and Texas Parks and Wildlife Department for $1 million to be used over the next 3 to 5 years to help plan and get to that finish line. And so with those funding sources set up and in place, I feel like we have a secure path moving forward to get us to our goal. A few next steps. We do need to select that consultant, and we should have that done by the turn of the new year probably. We need to establish our conceptual outline. What are the activities that we want to cover? What are GBRA's activities we want to cover? What are activities other than GBRA's in the basin that we need to make sure we have the ability to cover so that other folks can take advantage of the take protection? We need to decide what species that we're going to cover. And once we decide those two things, then we can start talking about those positive actions, the mitigation, the minimization measures that actually benefit the species and that we would implement through our habitat conservation plan. Definitely that openness, that transparency, we've got to continue that. So I see many more presentations like this in my future and many one-on-one meetings with stakeholders. Want to make sure everybody knows what we're doing and is supportive of what we're doing. And if not, ask them why and generate new ideas and try to find compromise. That's part of the process. And then the last thing I want to mention about next steps, this is a long marathon. It is not a sprint. And so it will take us 3 to 5 years to get across that finish line and receive that incidental take permit from U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So nothing's going to happen fast. We want to deliberate it. We want to think it through correctly. We want to set it up right. And there are regulatory frameworks that we have to work within too that's going to require us to take that amount of time. So please don't think that we're going to have an HCP established within the next year. It doesn't work like that, but we're working on it. We're being proactive, and everybody knows that that's what we're trying to do. Just to kind of try and wrap it up a little bit, we do have endangered species in our area here in Central Texas. We should not be scared of that. We should embrace the tools that are in the Endangered Species Act and be proactive working on those issues and finding resolution and solutions that work both for development and business operations and industry, but also work for species and quality of life for humans. And so I believe very strongly in that and have no doubt that we can achieve that here again in our local area as we've already done it before. Typically, this is where I would take questions, but instead, I think what I'm going to say is thank you for joining us today and for taking some time to learn about some issues we're facing here in Central Texas and the Guadalupe River Basin. And I have included my email on the screen. So if you do have any questions that you'd like to send to me, please feel free to do so, and I'll try to help you or answer those questions. Thanks, and have a great day.